appropriate spacing is something gardeners are terrible at. And it's not just tomatoes. It's flowers. It's everything. You read a packet, it says, space your plants a foot apart. So what do? That looks terrible. Look at all that ground in between. I'm going to plant them 2 or 3 inches apart, right?
I do that all the time. I look at my own packets now, I guess, with botanical. I go,
Yeah.
12? 12? I think I'll do 6. I think that's fine, And you know what I'll say, Craig, is this year, in an effort to decrease, not delete, the amount of disease on my tomatoes. So last year I did about a 12-inch spacing, and I did a Florida weave method, and they just got slammed. I had a great year of production, obviously, but they got slammed. And so I said, you know what, I'll do indeterminate, single leader, 2 feet apart, vertically trained, and prune everything off. And disease has been less. It's not 0, but it has been way less. I finally respected the spacing, and it worked out for me. We have Craig LeHoullier back on the show after a 4-year hiatus. Craig, you are back, PhD in chemistry. What I call you in my own mind is I call you sort of the godfather of tomato growing, just because of the level that you have taken this passion of yours. So since 2019, since you've been on the show, why don't you kick it off with a little bit of background on why I might call you that?
Oh, gosh. So can a godfather of tomatoes be French and German and Scottish and Irish, maybe? I've had a great time in the intervening 4 years, and I want to really thank you for having me back on. I kind of view myself as a coach and a teacher as well as a researcher. So any opportunity I have to help grow gardeners, we all know what COVID did. It sent everybody screaming to seed companies. People like you and I are there to try to make the COVID gardeners become permanent gardeners and help them through the frustrations. Yeah. But so I jumped into this really in 1986 when I discovered the Seed Savers Exchange, developed a love of heirlooms, started combing through the USDA collections, looking for tomatoes our grandfather and great-grandfathers may have grown, then started thinking about what container gardeners and patio gardeners might need and put together a project to create the dwarf growing tomatoes. We moved to Hendersonville down here, and I've been gardening for 40 years. I'm just a miserable person at retiring because I find myself busier and busier than ever. So I think it's my depth of interest in tomatoes and how I think that they encapsulate everything interesting there is about gardening. Yeah. And you can apply science, you can apply art, you can enjoy eating them, you can struggle with growing them, and we'll certainly talk about that because I've grown a lot of them, and they don't always cooperate.
Well, yeah, so that's kind of what, me too. So I have a couple things I do want to talk to you about later in the week, but I do kind of want to dive in. I'm always really curious why someone becomes obsessed with something. I think about that with myself in terms of generalist gardening and plants. But then for yourself, 40 years of gardening, I'm assuming no year was not a tomato year, right?
No year was not a tomato year. Yeah. And I developed sub interests in things like eggplants and peppers. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the tomato I'm not sure I grabbed onto the tomato so much as the tomato grabbed me.
What is it about the tomato? Obviously, it's a very popular plant. I don't think anyone here absolutely hates them, but to get to the level you've grown, I think last time we talked, you said you'd grown over 4,000 varieties, right?
Yeah, I think I'm probably well over that now. So I think the level of interest comes from the morphological differences. You've got so many shapes, sizes, colors, flavor nuances. You've got the story, the history, the fact that they're easy to save seed from. And they're just conversation starters. They're community builders. As you alluded to, almost every garden has them as a centerpiece. And so everybody is kind of interested in what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And then there's the dynamic of people creating newer and newer tomatoes, but being able to go in. I always remember how Kent Wheatley got the Seed Savers Exchange going in 1975 by creating a mechanism by which our vegetable varieties wouldn't go extinct. So I'm kind of the old dude that watches the catalogs flash all the anthos and stripes and the fancy hybrids, but I keep talking about the wonderful old heirloom varieties that if we don't grow them and save seeds from them and share them, they'll always suffer the possibility of going extinct somewhere down the line. So as long as I'm on this earth, I'm going to have a soft spot in my heart. But I think getting back to why tomatoes is all of that combination of the whole world in a crop. So peppers come in all kinds of colors and heat levels. but a pepper tastes like a pepper pretty much.
Hmm.
A green pepper tastes a little bit like biting on the lawn. Red peppers taste sweet or orange or yellow. Um, to me, the only things that mimic tomatoes in terms of the variety of different types of flavor nuances and colors would probably be apples and
Mm.
melons. Apples, they take the patience of a saint to grow many, many years, big areas. And melons are tough because they're not perfect flowered, so the bees can come in
Yeah.
and mess up your seed saving. So, tomatoes are a great way to get people to understand about gardening, the elementary factors about plant genetics. And when we talk about some of the things I've been up to, I've really had fun exploring tomato genetics, not from a book, but from what my garden is telling me, being Gregor Mendel,
Yeah.
doing the
From the
work and
field.
then seeing what comes. Yeah, from the
Yeah.
field.
I will say, first of all, I think maybe some pepperheads got mad when you said that the green pepper
Yep.
tastes like grass. But hey, you got to have a position, and I respect it completely. I wouldn't
We're
even.
one of the few countries that actually eats unripe
Yeah.
peppers, which is what green peppers
Yeah.
are. And I just don't. I think we're missing so many flavors and nuances if we don't let them hang on the
I
plant.
actually agree.
And you can't really, and you can't save seeds from
Yeah.
them unless they achieve that ripe color as
I
well.
actually agree, and it's when I realized in Mexico City that jalapenos
Mm,
were
yeah,
grown
yeah,
well past unripe into the red and then
right.
the corked phase, and I
Yes,
was like, oh shoot, and the flavor was more
mm,
complex, right? And so I was like, okay, and I can
exactly.
understand where
Yeah,
I've gone wrong in life, but
yeah,
so let's talk about. I know we're going to talk about the Dwarf Tomato Project, which we've chatted before. I'm curious to hear the
yeah,
updates, but you have a couple new things that
yeah.
you're up to as well.
Yeah. So I think the first major one was a few years ago, Joe Lampel asked me to put together an online tomato course with him, and that launched, and that's done really well for 3 years. And all the hard work was done. It was creating the garden and actually doing what I said I was going to do in Epic Tomatoes, so that we could film what happens if you actually do all of the right stuff around tomatoes. So that was fun. We talked about the Dwarf Tomato Project, and we'll talk lots more about that. But some new things. I always wondered what happens if you take favorite heirlooms and create a hybrid of them. Will the hybrid be better than each parent, lesser? So I did that with at least a dozen different pairs of my favorite tomatoes, and I've been working on that, creating the hybrid, wondering what that was like, and then growing out saved seed. That's a side project to create new tomatoes that I may be the only one interested. I think doing my weekly Instagram lives from my driveway from, say, March through September, that came from COVID
Hmm.
and needing to communicate with people and realizing if I make myself available 45 minutes every week and show them all of my successes, but also all of my failures, my dying tomato plants, and then just take questions for 20 minutes, people seem to really like that. Um, this just popped up. There is a veterans healing farm for veterans with PTSD that is just down the road. And after COVID eased up, they got in contact with me and gave me their greenhouse to grow
Oh
in.
well.
So I have 115 tomato plants and a crew to help me tend them. And the other thing we're doing is I'm planning 2 local tomato tastings that will happen in the next week. One at a farmer's market nearby, the other for that veterans farm. Learning that, trying to plan the date for tomato tasting is virtually impossible
Yeah.
because the season, the weather dictates when your tomatoes will be ripe.
Yeah.
And we missed the mark. The local one at the farmer's market, that was July 28th, I didn't have a single ripe tomato. The one that happens next week, my tomatoes will be largely
You're
past
over.
peak. So
Yeah.
you do what you
Yeah.
can. You talk to your friends. You say, hey, can I borrow a few tomatoes for you? So between all of these and maybe the last big potential project is Story has come back at me, and I think they finally want me to write the book on compact tomatoes,
Hmm.
the Dwarf Tomato Project. And so I'm not doing too much,
Yeah.
Kevin. I'm just dabbling here and there.
just casually being the true godfather of tomato growing, as I've called you. I mean, you're living up to the name. So here's a sort of sidebar question I have for you. I have chatted with our audience about this year in the garden. I think this is one of the more uncharacteristic years I've personally had growing. We in California at least had quite a gloomy spring and quite a wet spring. I got more rain in the first 2 months of the year than I did all of 2022. And from
Yeah.
February to May, actually a little bit into June, we did not technically have a fully sunny day in San Diego, California, which is just
Wow.
very rare, right? And so I was curious if that sort of cascaded across the country. And so where I'm going with this is my tomatoes are actually still not quite ripe for the most part. The cherries have come along, but a lot of my other stuff, my bigger stuff, is not. And it seems like a lot of our listeners are feeling the same. So I'm curious for you, like, what was the big difference this year, or was there one at all?
No, there was a significant difference. And so we lived in Raleigh 28 years before we moved to Hendersonville, which is the mountains of western North Carolina. The year we left Raleigh, we had 75 days of 90 or above. So already throughout those 28 years of gardening, I had to adjust. I had to adjust to what was going on out there. And spending days and days, 95 to 100 degrees on a concrete garden in containers was not fun. So Hendersonville, we're in the mountains at 2,500 feet. In our first 3 years here, I plan to get my plants in the straw bales or containers May 1st. This year it was May 8th because of endless rain, endless cool weather. So what that does is, you start your seeds, everything's going well, you transplant them, the roots are developing, but you're not getting very much top growth. So when you're trying to sell seedlings to people, they're wondering why they're so puny. You get that delay, and we've always picked tomatoes here, the 3 years I've lived here, around July 15th. This year, tomatoes started coming in on August 1st. So whether that's a slide of the same phenomena
Mm-hmm.
coming from the West Coast, but to me, the big point on that is if you're a gardener is read the weather app,
Yeah.
understand, and then also understand that your plants, you're going to be impacted by the weather and what you wear and how you feel. They're going to be impacted by the weather. And then there's the hidden, sometimes detriment of weather is it can change disease patterns and critter patterns. So that means you need to be an observant, very reactive gardener to be able to jump on these things that happen that you may not have seen before. So it's like a Rubik's Cube
Yeah.
gardening, but it sounds like you had a very uncharacteristically unusual,
Yeah.
as we did as well. So yeah, I've had a lot of emails about why are my tomatoes not ripening? And it's kind of the Paul Masson thing, no tomato will ripen before its time.
Yes.
It's the
Yes. Yeah.
genes in that
Mm-hmm.
tomato that tell it to. So patience is really a key, and tomato growers don't have much
No,
patience.
well, and because you expect you're sort of conditioned,
Yeah,
especially if you had a couple
yeah,
years of somewhat consistent weather patterns, et cetera, where you're like, oh, it's July, I should be slicing and having some,
yeah.
big old slicers or big old sandwiches, and it just didn't happen this year. So I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon, something I've been watching. What is the Dwarf Tomato Project?
So basically, the Dwarf Tomato Project was born from a question that I got from so many customers when I was selling seedlings, and it hit a peak in 2004. What have you got that tastes great, has the flavor range and the colors and the sizes of heirlooms, but I don't have to climb a ladder to pick it or figure out what it's doing in my yard because it's totally out of control. I'm on a patio or a deck or a driveway. So Patrina and I met in Garden Web, a website that we used to use just to chat gardening.
Mm-hmm.
And we put together a project where she would cross really delicious indeterminates with the very few known dwarf varieties at the time. And dwarfs are, many people don't understand what a dwarf tomato is. And it's not dwarf in fruit size, it's dwarf in growth habit. How I think of them is they will grow at half of the vertical rate as your indeterminate. So if you end up with an 8-foot Cherokee Purple at the end of your season, your corresponding dwarf will be about 4 feet tall, given some slight variations between varieties based on the parents and your weather that year. If you're only getting 2 hours of sun, your dwarf may end up 8 feet tall because it's just going to stretch and stretch and try to find that sun.
Interesting. A little counterintuitive there.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, we put together the project. I call it a crowd breeding project because we harnessed the talents of people all over the world who just were curious. The pay was terrible. It was
Yeah.
zero. So the reason people played in it is because they get to learn about tomato genetics. And the promise is you find something great, you give it a name, it ends up in a seed catalog, there is your name. So flash forward to now, we've got 150 named varieties. The company that we partnered through the most is Victory, but you will
And
also find them in Renaissance Farm and Adaptive Seeds and Fruition and Southern Exposure Seed Exchange and Restoration. The way that we launched these was to not do a big publicity splash. Let's get them out there, let gardeners use word of mouth, and then all of a sudden seed companies start seeing Victory with this whole huge list. Renaissance will order their seeds from Victory. They start carrying it. That's
oh
great.
yeah.
That we actually encourage that. It's a bottom-up approach, and it really is the public voting on what they love. So will all 150 varieties be widely grown and loved in 20 or 30 years? No, of course not, because we don't know of those 150 which will thrive in San Diego, which will go down to disease in a month, what will people up in New England want to grow. So we are trickling it along now. Our project has really shrunk down in terms of numbers of contributors, partly because gardeners are really interesting. You may have 100 people think this is a great thing to do, and within 5 years, 95 of them will say, thank you, that was fun.
Hmm.
I named a tomato, now I'm ready to move on. And then you get the people like me. I'm hardcore tomatoes. You get the hardcore people who do garden
Yeah.
R&D, and they're still with us. 10 more will probably come out sometime this year, and then they'll trickle on. We had an interesting phenomenon where Mike Dunton, my good friend who owned Victory Seeds, sold the company to Dave Whitinger of Dave's Garden fame. Yeah, the same quality, the same range of products, the same pretty much everything, except Dave is now running the ship and Mike is doing a little contract growing and finally enjoying life because he's not trying to run a really successful seed company with just a handful of
No
people.
kidding. Yeah.
So Dave and I are in close contact, and he's growing lots of the dwarfs out to refresh seed, and he wants to still be the company that is associated with doing the dwarf releases. And then if all goes well, I'll have a contract signed with Story in a month or so to write the book about the project because it is a story. People seem to want to hear it.
It's
If I
cool.
don't write the book, yeah, my wife will kill me because she's like, you've done all this work. Um, and the other interesting part about the Dwarf Project is strongly associated with the Open Source Seed Initiative, OSSI. So we're not breeding these to make money off.
Hmm.
We're happy if the seed companies make money off them, but we're not going to allow them through OSSI ensures that seeds don't get locked down and patented so that they can't be owned. People, if somebody grows Rosella Purple, I would love it if they said, oh, I'm going to cross Rosella Purple with something else and make new varieties. I'm like, bravo, how can I help?
Right.
What advice can I give you? So they're great in 5-gallon containers. They're great in straw bales. The other thing about them, though, is if you plant them in the ground, your yield will be higher. So it's
Mhm.
just with tomatoes, the more area you give the roots to spread, the more nutrients you can get into the plant, and the more fruit you'll get out. However, they will do fine in 5-gallon grow bags or straw bales.
Yeah.
So they have opened up the world of heirloom tomatoes to people who have been afraid to grow indeterminates before just because they didn't have the physical capabilities or the space to deal with all the growth that they put out.
Yeah, I've grown a few, and so has Jacques on our team. And obviously, we both have in-ground space these days, and so we can do whichever one we want. We can put it in a 5-gallon, we can put it in a 15, we can put it in the ground. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of like the backyard orchard culture methodology for growing fruit trees, where for
Yes.
me, I live in my house with my girlfriend, and I can I actually eat off of 15 tomatoes a year? Actually, probably not. Like it's eventually too many. So if you were to grow them in a 5-gal, I might even opt to do that just to experiment, right? So put a
Yeah.
few in,
Yeah.
and yeah, my yield's down. That's fine. I'm not trying to maximize yield. Maybe I'm trying to maximize variety or experimentation. And something that jumped out. I don't know if this is possible or not, but given that we now own a seed company, if there's any way that we can offer some of these or expand the reach,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's actually interesting. Like having the tangible interests under our wing now, it's fascinating what you learn about the seed trade and how you can patent right a seed and how it's done and all that kind of stuff. And should it be done and why do people do it and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to offer some to folks.
Well, what I can do is I have this thing called a photographic
Yeah.
memory. So I could tell you of those 150, what they look like, what they taste like, where their struggles are. So we can have a chat sometime about a good starter kit.
Sure.
Because they do have some interesting idiosyncrasies. They're very densely foliaged. So people who garden in humid areas, if they don't have great garden hygiene and don't pay attention, you can get some pretty good septoria or early blight going on those varieties that you have to get in there and prune. But and it's funny because the micro dwarf type tomatoes like Red Robin, they've come along now in a way kind of mimicking the type of project that we put together for the
When we say
dwarfs.
micro dwarf, Craig, do we mean like a tiny Tim's sized tomato, like maybe two and a
Yes.
half feet max?
Yeah. 6 to 12 inches in a 1-gallon container. Typically, they've had a little bit of an issue trying to get large fruit size in the micro dwarfs because the genetic trait of cherry tomato is very, very, very strong.
Mm.
So you have to try to breed beyond that a little bit. But right now we're playing with interesting things like I've got it. We developed a chartreuse leaf dwarf,
Oh,
and that came from a chartreuse leaf mutant of mortgage lifter that a woman in West Virginia sent me. And I've created some variegated leaf dwarfs, which one
wow.
of my friends won't grow because she says it looks like the birds pooped on your
Yeah.
plants. But I love variegated
Me too.
foliage.
Yeah.
So I've just done a cross that will hopefully lead to a variegated chartreuse leaf plant. You get the silvery fir tree, fine foliage. We haven't really played in that playground yet. But my original intent was think of heirlooms. What are the colors? What are the shapes? What are the sizes? How can we use the genetics that we've learned to replicate each one of those types of tomatoes in a dwarf growing variety? And, we're kind of partway through that. I could create that grid and tick off which ones we've succeeded at, but they have a range of flavors. Some people are going to love them. Some people, I look at Victory where they can rate some of them. They get 3 stars, and I'm like, you're right. That one's not my
Yeah.
favorite.
Yeah.
But I bet you somewhere in Alaska and New Hampshire where it's really cold, they're going to love it.
Yeah.
So,
That's actually an interesting point. Theoretically, if it was the only tomato you could grow in Alaska, de facto, it's the best
yes,
tomato, right? You
exactly.
get that
Well, the
flavor.
best tomato you ate is the last one you went out and
Yeah,
picked, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so okay, well, we'll put more info on the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project in the description. Something that you've done is you've grown so many tomatoes, and many of these are in containers or straw bales.
Right. It was all born out of necessity because in our house in Raleigh, the garden that I hand dug, the tulip poplars and the loblolly pines grew to the point where the only place where the sun shone was in the driveway.
Hmm.
So I developed an expertise in container gardening first and realized if you can grow it in the ground, you can grow it in a container as long as you understand the dynamics of the plant and what its needs are. And then when Story asked me to write the book on straw bale gardening, I fell totally in love with that as well. So now all of my gardens are a mix of straw bales and containers because we're gardening on our septic field in our backyard. It gets full sun, but planting above the ground allows us to have a full garden where I really couldn't dig it. You get equivalent yields. One of the real advantages is you get enhanced disease handling issues because you can start with sterile planting mix. You can start with a straw bale, it's just a block of cellulose that you have to actually crank up to get it breaking down. I think the last interesting thing to say about straw bale gardening before we jump in is it was actually based on Ruth Stout's lasagna gardening principles. And then it was written up in literature in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In fact, pickle companies used to grow their cucumbers in straw bales. So it was the books that came out in the last 10 or 20 years popularized it.
Hmm.
But the concept of straw bale gardening actually goes back about 70 years, which is kind of interesting that it was never really, never really fully developed for the home gardener until recently.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess Ruth Stout really did sort of put the genesis theory out there with her sort of straw on ground, I suppose. Did she ever put any content out about straw like as a bale, or was she more?
No,
Yeah.
no, she was more the concept. And then there was I think it was Dr. Wade in University of Florida wrote an article, perhaps for Mother Earth, for organic gardening or Mother Earth News way back in the 70s about it. So it trickled out, but it was never picked up as a big splash that you would want to write in books. And now I grow pretty much everything. And in fact, I get superior performance in straw bales for eggplant, peppers, tomatoes.
Superior.
Superior. This year I'm growing melons. And an anecdotal one is I've never lost a summer squash plant to a squash vine borer since I've been growing squash in straw bales.
That is curious because you would imagine it would still have access to the plant.
Yeah, I don't know why, but we still have summer squash out there that I direct seeded on April 1st, and they're beyond me. There's so many squash out there. I can use them as baseball bats at this point because you don't want to eat squash anymore, so you just let them grow.
Yeah, no, I have a few of those myself. Fortunately, the ones I've grown this year are mostly, like I've grown the birdhouse gourd and the Corsican gourd, and so those are supposed to be grown for that purpose. But okay, so let's bring it back to the actual practicalities of straw bale, because I will be honest. I've tried it once. It was
Mhm.
4 or 5 years ago. I wasn't as good at gardening as I am now. I just sort of failed at it, honestly. I think the conditioning of the bale process, some of this I just sort of messed up. So maybe we could go with a 101.
Yeah, well, it's really pretty simple in that you have a straw bale that will become a future compost heap, which will then create a perfect plant environment for the roots of your plant. So it really comes down to a week of alternating days of a high dose of nitrogen. And this is okay for organic gardeners as well. You can use blood meal or fish emulsion. I call myself a gardener on the journey to being organic, but I'm organic in intent,
Hmm.
meaning I will use what helps me grow great vegetables. So I'll use a lawn starter, like a 2805 granular, 1/2 cup per bale, alternating days. You're watering every day, and then you hit it hard with the 10-10-10 or whatever balanced food. If you're organic, you can go with like an espoma 5-6-5, anything like that. And then at the end of 2 weeks from starting, you can plant them because that straw softens up. You've got the centers of those bales in many cases will raise to 130 degrees. It starts chewing up the center. You're creating loam. Then you just create a little crevice with your hands and slip your root ball of your tomato or pepper or eggplant in, and they take off like a rocket. Now, like container gardening, container and straw bale gardening are, I call them relatively high maintenance
Yep.
processes, particularly in warm areas, because what are you going to have to do? Water frequently. The sun is beating down. The roots are only going to get the moisture that's in the confines of the bale or the container. So I'm a daily waterer and I'm a weekly feeder. And I'm not fussy about what I feed. I just use a general all-purpose. But I've seen 30, 35 pounds of tomatoes per plant, 2 plants per
Wow.
bale. That's 70 pounds of tomatoes per straw bale because a straw bale is the equivalent of two 20-gallon containers.
Yeah. Okay.
And if you think about what type of a yield you can get giving the roots of your plants that type of an area, that is why you get that big boost in yield.
Yeah, I think what I did wrong is the conditioning process, I was not precise enough. I wasn't sort of rigorous enough about it, and I just didn't get to the loam phase. Perhaps also put the tomatoes in as it was heating, which obviously will kill them. And so that's sort of where I went wrong. And you've said that you get better results than in the ground sometimes. And so where's someone going wrong besides some of the stuff I already mentioned?
Well, so you can, as you said, you can under prepare them. Whether it's that your gardening philosophy pushes you aside from using like a pure urea or a 2805, going more towards a Milorganite or a fish emulsion or something like that, it may not get it cranking enough to create that loam. The other problem that's arising, and this is happening more and more, is I guess fields are getting sprayed with some persistent herbicides that then make it up into the hay that's embedded. So in my 5 years now of doing straw bale gardening, I've had 2 bales out of, say, 200 that have actually killed my plants. And it is because I'm almost certain they were herbicides because I was growing a sun gold plant. It never looked happy. It was always wilty. I cut off a sucker, put it in water, it perked up. I planted it in a container.
Died.
It was a beautiful
Yeah.
plant.
Yeah.
So the bale was killing my plant. So that's, you can very rarely get someone to say, yes, that's an organic straw bale. You have to test your vendors. Okay, buy 2 from here, 1 from there. But you know this, Kevin, as well. When you're learning a new gardening technique, I always advise people don't jump in whole hog. Oh, straw bale gardening looks good to me. I'm going to plant 40 straw bales. No, no. Try 1 or 2. See if it's for you. Container gardening, see if setting up transmitters for each pod or being able to go out there and water them when they need it, because I think that's the other place people go wrong is they starve their plants from either water or nutrients because they're accustomed to growing in the ground where the roots can spread and reach what they need. When you're in a container or a straw bale with a confined root area, you are the person who has to supply what those plants need when they need it. So things like blossom end rot become a real problem because your plants get dry in the heat of the day, the plant's stressed, the calcium uptake is inhibited, and there you
It's
go.
something that I undervalued a lot when I was first starting in container gardening. It's I would This is a bit of an extreme statement, but it's more like hydroponic growing than it is soil gardening. Because the soil, which there is soil, of course, in these containers, I guess in straw bales, maybe not, but let's just say a 10-gallon grow bag or something, that's a potting mix. But you are the person adding the water, you are the person adding the ferts. And when you're growing your in-grounds, how often are you adding supplemental fert, if at all?
Probably, you water, if it's raining regularly, you're maybe watering once every couple of weeks if they're getting enough. And I'm a plant reader. So if the plants are not really wilting much in the hot part of the day, they're
Yeah.
happy. And I'm feeding maybe 2 or 3 weeks, just a little bit to augment it. There's an anecdotal saying that a lot of the heirloom varieties actually need less fertilizer to perform up to their capability. So some of the newer hybrids maybe, yeah. But you just said something that no one has ever mentioned to me that I use as an analogy, in that it is like hydroponics. And how I've proven that is I've grown indeterminate tomatoes in 5-gallon grow bags with only 2 gallons of potting mix and gotten big yields
Yeah.
from it because I am just watering them 2 or 3 times a
Yeah.
day and feeding them a couple of times a week. I am providing what that plant needs, which is very much a hydroponic demand type of a system.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because hydroponics is it's how I started, so I have a lot of love for that method, and it's the most, I guess, scientifically precise way of growing, I suppose you could say. But it does sort of isolate every variable and cause the human to provide all
Yes.
of it, versus a much more natural. Like my outdoor garden these days is pretty sort of hands off. And so, yeah, it's a sliding scale, and I've never thought about that either. I mean, container gardening is, I guess it is more akin to hydroponics. The one thing I will ask here for those who are saying, cool, well, teach me a little bit more about, let's say, the containers. Do you have a
Yeah.
favorite container you like for tomatoes specifically? And then on a fertilization schedule in the
Right.
container, is there something that is a good rule of thumb?
Right. So I've actually using a California company called Peaceful Valley to buy my grow bags. I'm a big fan of plastic grow bags. They're inexpensive and they last. Some of my grow bags I've had for 12 years. So, and I don't like to overbuy plastic. I don't like to put plastic into the environment. So if you can buy a gardening implement that you can keep for a long time, the holes are pre-punched. The fact that they're black means they absorb
Hmm.
the rays of the sun, which means they actually shorten the semi-maturity dates on plants because you're absorbing all that heat. And I just go with a roughly 3-to-1 mix of a good quality soilless mix augmented with a composted manure, like a black cow type of thing. 3-to-1. I'm not precise on it. Fill my bags up and then just plant my plants in it. I used to even bleach and detergent my bags, but I've realized that septoria and early blight, when you're gardening in areas like I am particularly here, it's
It's all
everywhere.
over the
So you
place,
can you can start with an absolutely clean environment, but why waste your time doing that? Because your plants are going to get it
Hmm.
anyway. It's going to blow in from other places. The best thing you can do is just be really religious about removing that blemished foliage. But I'm watering pretty much daily by reading my plants. If I go out at noon and I see my plant really wilting, it's like, go water it. And this is where discipline is so necessary for gardeners because it's a hot day, indoors is nice and cool, you're kind of tired, that crossword puzzle's waiting. Your plants are telling you you need to go do
Yeah.
something. So if you go do something, you'll have better results than if you always like take the easy way out and not do that task. And then I feed if I'm watering daily, I'm feeding pretty much
Okay.
weekly. And each plant gets about a cup and a half of a typical solution of an all-purpose, mixed up a tablespoon per gallon. Each plant gets a cup and a half. And I've had great results with it to the point where my yields are at the point where I'm not adjusting my NPK ratios as the season wears on because I'm getting plenty of blooms, I'm getting plenty of blossom set. Um, so why change what you're doing if it works? And I know when you get to topics like feeding, man, if you get 100 gardeners in a room, there's going to be 100
Oh yeah.
methods that they like to
Maybe
use to feed
200
and water
for
their
100
plant.
gardeners,
Maybe,
honestly.
maybe 200. So I've found that the best way to do it is not be preachy about it and share what I do, and that other people hear that, but they're going to then adjust or say, nope, that's not for me. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And then everybody's kind of happy at the end of the
Yeah.
day.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'm hearing from this is you don't really do anything fancy. You just actually do the
Yeah.
things, right? It's funny you mentioned that because people will ask us, well, what do you recommend for grow bag sizing? Because we just came out with some grow bags, and we go, okay, well, you can technically, to the point we've been talking about, grow it in any size, but your
Yeah.
effort input is going to be higher. And so to me, I go like, I like a 10 gal minimum on tomatoes. I just want a little more soil buffer, but I could have pulled it off in a 5, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so,
I think the other factor is people are going to think about where they put their money when they garden.
hmm
And certainly the most inexpensive way of gardening is a garden
yeah,
where you can just go out and dig in the soil. When you get into containers, your biggest financial outlay once you get your containers is going to be what you put in
hmm
them. When you straw bale garden, you pay, well, we out here pay about $6, maybe a little bit higher now for one straw bale. You use it, you grow your crop, and then you get this beautiful pile of loam that you can mix into your grow bags. What I did this year is filled 20-gallon containers with that spent straw and just put seed potatoes in. And they grow nice and clean. And I'll get potatoes out of that. I think the last big ticket item for straw for me is bush beans. You can prepare your bales and overlay them with about a 3-inch layer of potting mix, and then just direct seed things like beans or cucumbers or squash. And the yields are just
hmm
outrageous. And you can pull up a chair and pick your beans and not have to break your back. And it's just this nice little, maybe because I'm an old dude, I look for ways to not have to bend over all
it's
day
not
long.
just because you're an old dude, because I do that all the time. I like bring buckets around, or our raised beds are 30 inches tall already. I'm just like, dude, I know I'm going to be old one day, so I better
Yeah.
protect the back right now, right?
Yeah,
So
and bush beans are like, and here's the thing with gardening: you overplant. So I planted 2, 4, 6, 8 summer squash plants, 4 bales pushed together. That was so stupid, but what you do is you risk plan. What if a squash vine borer
100%. Yeah.
gets them?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you overplant, you overproduce, but that's better than not having enough of what you want when you want it. So
A lot of us will say, well, 40% of food at the grocery store is wasted. Grow your own. It's better. It's healthier. I know all the reasons for that. Of course, we both do it. I've started to be of this opinion because I overplant as well, and I overproduce. And a lot of people ask, what do you do with all that overproduction? And we do try to do the best we can. So we have a donation partner
yes,
locally that we
yep.
send it to. That being said, I actually will take the position that I think it's okay if you were to have 5-15% loss in the sense of it was good, but you didn't use it. If it's cycling back into some system, it's certainly still better than having it grown in a monoculture, transported, double transported,
Oh
bought,
yeah,
and then thrown
oh
away,
yeah.
right? Like it's definitely still better.
Well, whether you like, we're composting are way too big to eat summer squash because that will make compost to
Mm-hmm.
put into our gardens for next year. The Veterans Healing Farm will take any of our excess and give that away. And I won't eat a tomato between the last one I pick from my garden and the first one I pick the next year. So we can.
That's an extreme position. I love it. I love it. Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
know. So right now, today we're doing our 5th canning run. That will give us 35 quarts. I think our record is 63
Mm-hmm.
quarts during that first year of COVID. I dry them down in the oven till they're kind of leathery and put them in freezer bags and use them for recipes. Or we make sauce.
Mm-hmm.
And to make sauce, I just take a big roasting pan, throw all the cut tomatoes in, and just put it 300 degrees for like 6 hours, and we freeze or can that. So we eat from our garden. We freeze peppers. We just chop. We don't, you just put them in freezer bags and stick them in the
Yeah.
freezer, and they're
Yeah.
fine to use in sautés. So, but yeah, gardeners feel particularly bad if they see a summer squash get too big
Mm-hmm.
and it's not edible anymore, or because we have this thing, if we grow it,
There's this
we have to
implication
do
you have
something
to do
with it.
something, and it's weird because there are things we grow that we do nothing with, right?
Yes,
Obviously any ornamental, but also any
yes.
cover crop, the whole purpose is to grow it and waste it on the ground. And so I sometimes in my own mind, I mean, I have chickens, I have a compost, I have worm compost, so I have a lot of ways to cycle it out, and again, most of the time I do. Sometimes though I go, yeah, maybe that was just a cover crop, edible, happened to be, chop it up, throw it on the ground, it's okay, you know.
Well, you also get to that point where you've had it, and we're
Yeah,
approaching it.
yeah,
In
we
in
are.
2 or 3 weeks, my backyard will be empty because we'll have done all of our canning, all of our eating, all of our seed saving, and that's when it's time to go hiking or kayaking and not have to worry about going out 90-degree heat and watering the garden.
It's
So,
a real thing. You want to take a vacation
yeah,
from the so-called vacation of the garden, right? Which sometimes, as we know, can not feel like one.
I heard this line at a Seed Savers exchange meeting once. It's the tyranny of the harvest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's everything comes in at once, and you're pressured to do something with it, and you lose sleep because your tomatoes are starting to rot on the shelf, and the fruit flies are showing up. you need to do something with it. And I've even learned that tomato's bad. It's going into the compost heap.
Yeah.
I'm not going to feel
Yeah,
bad
no,
about
me
it.
neither.
So
Me
yeah,
neither. How do we get the best tomatoes we've ever grown? Because that's really the reason you're growing them at home. Otherwise, you just go to the grocery store.
that's right. And, I guess I have to confess that the people who watch me on Instagram every week take such delight when they see my mistakes. So that's the other thing about gardening expertise is I have to tell people I'm an experienced gardener, but even I can't guarantee absolute success every year. So this is a set of things to help you best succeed. And I think it starts with a few very early things. It's your seed source. Use a reliable seed source. Make sure you know what you're looking for with tomatoes because there's 10 or 12,000 minimum varieties of tomatoes out there. If you get the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook, whether each of those 10 or 12,000 is distinct or not would be up for a geneticist to determine. And I'm sure that many of these are synonyms, tomatoes that have taken on different names through the years. But there's a lot. You've got sizes and colors and shapes. Do you want to grow tall or short? So as you're ordering your seed, think about your garden space. Think about your hours of sun. Pick your varieties to succeed in the areas you're growing them in. So you've got your seeds. You're going to start seeds, which is fun and it's not
Hmm.
difficult, but don't go out in your garden and just dig dirt and bring it in the house and put them in your seeds trays. You want to build quality in every step of the way, and you don't want to introduce issues early on. So tomatoes are a magnet for every disease known to gardeners. They're kind of like roses. So you've got maybe 10 different viral diseases, 15 different bacterial diseases, 20 or 30 different
Yeah.
fungal diseases. And if you garden, one or more of them will find you, guaranteed. I always kind of crack up when somebody sends me a picture of a leaf and there's a little tiny
Yeah, I
blemish
know. I'm
on it.
like, that's the least of your problems.
Come and look at my garden.
Yeah.
It's like it's all that color right now. So use a good sterile seed starting mix. There's so many good ones out there. I won't go into names, but it drains well, it absorbs water well. Plant your seeds nice and shallow. There's a whole, on my website, there's a whole primer on how to start
Yeah.
seeds. But really, then another really early factor, understand your weather, meaning when are you going to get those plants out? I like to use this kind of mnemonic of I'm going to plant seed, and in a month from that, I'm going to be transplanting to a larger container in a single pot, and then a month from that, I'm going to be putting in my garden. So if I estimate I'm going to have a May 1st plant out date, I work back and I pretty much start my seeds on March 1st. That's for me, Zone 7A, Western North Carolina. Understand what your last frost date is and work backwards from that. Appropriate spacing is something gardeners are terrible at. And it's not just tomatoes. It's flowers, it's everything. You read a packet, it says space your plants a foot apart. So what do? That looks terrible. Look at all that ground in between. I'm going to plant them 2 or 3 inches apart, right?
I do that all the time. I look at my own packets now, I guess, with botanical. I go,
Yeah.
12? 12? I think I'll do 6. I think that's fine, And you know what I'll say, Craig, is this year, in an effort to decrease, not delete, the amount of disease on my tomatoes. So last year I did about a 12-inch spacing, and I did a Florida weave method. And they just got slammed. I had a great year of production, obviously, but they got slammed. And so I said, you know what, I'll do indeterminate, single leader, 2 feet apart, vertically trained, and prune everything off. And disease has been less. It's not zero, but it has been way less. I finally respected the spacing, and it worked out for me.
Yeah, and the spacing is allowing the sun, which is the best disinfectant of all, and the air, which dries your foliage off, to keep that disease at bay. I think so. Adequate spacing. You want to be able to walk through your plants if you can. You want the sun to shine on as many sides of the plant as it can. Then it's about living with your tomatoes, meaning what does it look like when it's happy? What does it look like when it needs something? Wilting, getting pale in color. Look for the critters. Look for the telltale blemishes on the leaves and get them off. A lot of people say, well, what do you spray your plants with? And I say, well, I don't spray it, but that's my own philosophical decision. Well, I have the time to be out with my tomatoes every day. And when I see those small blemishes, I can remove that foliage. Don't put it in the compost because you'll be putting septoria fungi or early blight fungi. But that, on the flip side of leaves with the blemishes, are the spores. And if you leave them on the plant, they float around and they land on other leaves, which is the other big point. Don't water from above. Keep your foliage as dry as possible because wet foliage is a magnet for any disease blowing around. One of the tricks North Carolina growers are starting to use is use a high tent. And so you're keeping the rain off the leaves, you're irrigating the plants at the bottom. They're having at least another month of productivity before disease hits. So dry foliage means healthier plants. Um, well, don't starve your tomatoes from either food or water. And this is all in relation to how you're growing them. So if you're in the ground, you need to water and feed less. If you're in containers and straw bales, you need to water and feed more. The other thing I've learned is pick your tomatoes when they're kind of half ripe at the bottom. The shoulders are still green. You will reduce the problem that many heirloom lovers have with cracking.
Mm-hmm.
So if you leave an heirloom tomato on the plant, you leave your Brandywine or your Cherokee Purple until it's totally colored, odds are you're going to have either concentric cracks, which go around the stem, or radial cracks, which go out from the stem. Fruit flies get in there, ants. Shortens the shelf life of your tomatoes to practically nothing. Whereas if
Day,
you
maybe, yeah.
pick them half green, half colored, let them ripen on the shelf. It will extend the life of those tomatoes. The other real big fringe benefit is critters that are marauding around won't be as attracted to them. So, we've developed this mystique about the vine ripened tomato, but actually, if you pick your tomatoes half ripe and ripen them indoors and blindfold yourself, you would not be able to take.
That's
No,
something that
absolutely.
I picked up from Jacques because he's the tomato obsessed of the two of us. We both love him. He's absolutely obsessed. And so he brought that up to me. He's like, yeah, I mean, you really can just pick them at the breaker stage, right? That half red
The
stage,
breaker stage.
flip them
Yeah,
upside down, store them inside. And what I found is not only, of course, the shelf life is increased and the disease pressure's down and pest pressure's down, but it helps me meter out the flow of tomatoes into the home. It helps me like go,
exactly.
oh, I'm not overwhelmed. Because sometimes I'll, like you, I mean, I'll get overwhelmed and I'll be like, dude, do I really need 42 today? And so I'll say, okay, who can I pawn these off on? Or I don't have time to make the sauce today, whatever it is. So it does help quite a bit. A question I have about I kind of want to go a little bit back into the sterile seed mix. So you had mentioned that it's in the air no matter what, right? And so when we say sterile seed mix, some gardeners will say, hey, why bother? Because it's going to get unsterilized the second it goes into the soil. Is that mostly just to prevent like damping off, et cetera, early disease?
It's really about damping off because most tomato diseases, even though they're present, won't
Yeah.
trigger until you get really, really warm weather. So that is the bane of seed starters, is damping off. And it's really frustrating because your seeds germinate, they're about 2 or 3 inches tall, and it's like John Bunyan
Boom.
went
Yeah.
through and started chopping them off. So you can avoid that almost exclusively by good airflow with your seedlings and using a sterile mix. There's another thing is take notes. So throughout your gardening season, things are going to happen. And I've found my Instagram lives that I do every week is now like a diary
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I can see my garden. I can hear what I was talking about. I know where the issues are. Gardening is a big continuous improvement project. So you don't want to Einstein it. The definition of insanity, of course, is doing the same thing over and over and over again and then being disappointed because things don't work out.
Hmm.
So change a little something every year. Um, the scientist in me doesn't like to change too many variables at once because you want to find out if what you changed is going to make the positive difference. So I'm going to do 5 different things. It works, but you don't know which of those 5 different things worked. The other, I think, important thing about tomatoes these days, let's say somebody raves about a variety,
Hmm.
Cherokee Purple. You get it, you grow it, it doesn't taste very good. Don't say, I don't like Cherokee Purple. Say, I have a feeling my seed source for that Cherokee Purple was not correct because I was party to a study that was done at MIT a few years ago. I sat in on an interesting call where they grabbed Cherokee Purple from about 40 different seed companies and they DNA sequenced it. And I think it was a third of the companies were selling Cherokee Purple, a third of the companies were selling Black Crim and calling it Cherokee
Yeah.
Purple. And a third of the companies had no idea because it was so genetically crossed up. And so I see pictures online. Look at my first Cherokee Purples. I'm, it's Black Crim. How do I know? Black Crim cracks concentrically. It's a little more oblate than round. And if I cut it in half, it has a different array. Now, this is getting into the epitome of tomato
Sure.
geekiness, where I
Sure.
can
Yeah.
identify a tomato just by looking at it. So it's kind of like baseball, 3 strikes and you're out. But usually tomatoes get raved about for a reason. And if you've had a disappointment with the variety, just change the seed source. Email me because I actually have been involved in a lot of these varieties since the mid 80s. So I kind of know where I shipped varieties off to when I received them. And, so Johnny's was a recipient of Yellow Brandywine, Cherokee Purple, Cherokee Green, Tiger Tom. I sent a whole bunch to Victory. I sent a whole bunch to Southern Exposure Seed
See, this
Exchange.
is
And
what
I
I'm
would
saying,
hope.
Craig. The Godfather is a man who has done something like that. I mean, you're so deep into the well. Don't you have some sort of legend about? Didn't you name one of the most classic varieties of
Yeah.
all time?
Yeah, so Cherokee Purple came to me in 1990 as an unnamed tomato, and the fellow who sent it to me just knew there was this nut who lived in Pennsylvania who collected
Yeah,
tomatoes,
you.
and he just thought of
Yeah.
me. And so the story, now that we know a little bit more about it,
Yep.
there was a woman named Jean Greenlee in Rutledge, Tennessee, whose grandfather received it in the late 1800s from the Cherokee Nation. He shared it with his granddaughter, Jean. Jean shared it with J.D., probably at a garden event, J.D. Green. And it was J.D. who sent it to me. And all I did was share it on Seed Savers Exchange and send it to Jeff McCormick at Southern Exposure. And I always remember, I love the conversation I had with him. This tomato is so bloody ugly.
Mm.
Nobody is ever going to want to buy it or grow it. But I'm going to list it in my 1993 catalog with a caveat only for the very adventurous. And look what's happened. And this is the 30-year anniversary of the first time Cherokee Purple appeared in a seed
Yeah.
catalog. It just struck me. I hadn't even thought
I,
of that. So
I
yeah.
think it's just so fascinating that that is a piece of your tomato history. I could only hope that I would have some sort of plant legend like that. It's so
But
cool.
this is why I didn't pick the tomatoes.
Yeah.
Actually, all through, whether it's Lucky Cross because the bees did just the right
Yeah.
experiment in my
Yeah.
garden. And so I think all gardeners have something to learn and give if you just leave yourself open to growing out the thing that doesn't look right, playing around with it, use your garden like a laboratory, use it like a playground. It's therapy in these crazy days we live in. The garden is the one place I go
I
sometimes to
agree. I
regain my
agree.
sanity.
Yeah. I mean, I think of it, we run weird experiments, some on purpose, some accidental as well. Like we found that we could grow hardneck garlic in our climate, which really sort of doesn't want to be grown, by refrigerating for 3 full months and then planting in
Wow.
January. And then you grow it out and you get it in June.
Yeah.
And it actually worked. And we got some good garlic. So like, it's like these random little things that you find, but what are the best ones to grow in my area? Maybe for growing conditions, but also like
Sure.
if you grow for flavor, you grow for flavor. And so
Right. Right.
what do we know about tomato flavor and breeds?
Yeah. So this is such an interesting topic. The first thing we think about, or I think about, is nostalgia. So we eat with our eyes, we eat with our memories. So if your first memory of eating tomatoes is like in my case, grown by my beloved grandfather, coming out of his garden, I'm going to say that is the tomato taste that I look for, and then that becomes what I judge. It's kind of like I like classical music, and I've got at least 20 versions of each of Mahler's
Hmm.
symphonies. My favorite ones of each are often the ones that introduced me to the piece of
Yeah.
music, even though so the other 19 are fine, but I'm looking for what it is that drew me in. So that's one thing. This thing about eating with our eyes is fascinating because even through seed catalogs, right from the late 1800s, this golden tomato is of milder flavor. This white tomato is a low acid treat. And so they weren't doing any science behind this. They were just eating with their eyes. And if you look at a white tomato, you think insipid,
Hmm.
sweet, bland. So flash forward to now, and after having grown and tasted well over 5,000 varieties, I've come to the conclusion that tomato varieties are like us. They are unique packets of genes that will each have their color, their shape, their size, but their flavor. So at the end of my talk on tomatoes, I always like to show three categories: tart, sweet, and intense. Because really, through all my years of selling tomato plants, those were a lot of what my questions were. What happened to that tomato that I had when I was a child, and it was so acidic you bite into it? And so they're longing for that experience. Or I want a tomato that tastes like a fruit. I can't handle acidity, so I need fruit. And then there's my type. I want to be able to wake up in the morning knowing that I'm going to eat my first Lillian's Yellow Heirloom today, or my first Nepal, or my first Cherokee Purple. These are intense tomatoes. These are the ones that tomato growers always have a lot of in their garden, but they're the ones that a lot of people who are wishy-washy about the flavor of tomatoes, they would probably shy away from. If they're used to whatever is served on their McDonald's bun, they probably may not like the intense tomatoes. It's too much umami, too much this, too much that. So then I break it down into the fact that through my tasting experience, I can find people sweet tomatoes in every color. So let's say you want a tomato that the first thing you think about is fruit when you taste it. So Anna Russian, which is a pink tomato, Great White, which is a white tomato, Kellogg's Breakfast, which is an orange tomato. So these are tomatoes that have really, really distinct sweetness to them. German Johnson, which is actually the only authentic North Carolina heirloom, a big, ugly pink tomato. The first thing you think about when you eat it is sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the ugly heirloom, right? For tart tomatoes, Americans seem to be eating sweet these days. And if you grow a lot of heirlooms, you realize many of them are tilted towards the sweeter scale. But you can find tart tomatoes. And Acres, West Virginia, Andrew Rayhart's Jumbo Red. Yellow, Azoichka, which came over from Russia in 1990 through the Seed Savers Exchange, is one of the most tart tomatoes I've ever eaten. Green Zebra, which a lot of people
Classic.
know
Yep.
about. Dwarf Mr. Snow, which is a white tomato from our Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project, that won our whole Tomatopalooza tasting out of 250 varieties one year because people gravitated to that incredible, refreshing, almost tingling tartness on the tongue. And, then you get to the intense tomatoes. So that's Cherokee Purple. It's Green Giant. It's Lillian's Yellow Heirloom. It's Brandywine. Look at all the different colors, Cherokee Chocolate. So when you really realize this is if you are fortunate enough to try a blind tasting. And to wrap up the course that I did with Joe Lample, I took some great tomatoes I grew and brought them down to his house in Georgia. And we sat there and I was sweating bullets because if these 20 tomatoes were some of my favorites, was I going to be able to pick them out as my favorites blindfolded when I didn't know what order I was eating them in? So we were tasting, and there is nothing like tasting something blind because all of your concentration is focused. What is this that's on my tongue? What does it really taste like? And then we took the blindfolds off, and the tomato that won was Captain Lucky. Wonderful green tomato. It's the best tomato in my garden the last 2 years. Cherokee Purple, Cherokee Chocolate came out at 8.5 to 9 by both Joe and I. So I went,
Yeah.
because it kind of validates that I didn't love that tomato because it's got a cool story associated with it.
You
or
took
because
away
I'm
the story,
associated
the
with it.
context, and here's a question I have.
And the knowledge, yeah.
Mr. Lucky, right? Would you have disrespected it somehow subconsciously because it was green and perhaps maybe not normal looking and rated the flavor down if you had seen it?
I wouldn't have because some of my favorite tomatoes are green when ripe, but I guarantee you that a group of tomato, not necessarily novices, but people who are less familiar with tasting a lot of different tomatoes may have looked at it and thought, oh, I bet that's going to taste grassy
Yeah.
or kind of sour. So we do have expectations. This whole thing about refrigerating tomatoes, I think that's part of nostalgia.
Mm.
They like the flavor of refrigerated tomatoes because that's what their mom did. When they went to a farm stand and got tomatoes, she stuck them in the freezer, brought them up for the cookout that night. So that cooked, mushy experience is what brings them back to their
That's so,
childhood.
I never thought of it that way, but it makes sense because I think about, you brought up the music. I grew up playing classical piano. And so, for me, there's certain songs, obviously, but also I grew up also in the LimeWire, Napster, Kazaa era of downloading music. So you download stuff. So you download a track, let's say of, I don't know, a pop punk band in the 90s, and it would be an unofficial track, like from a live show, but that's the first time I heard the song. So now the studio version, I'm like, this is trash compared to the first time I heard and loved it. I never thought about nostalgia with flavor like that. It's really cool. The question I have, though, I guess, is there is that, which is a real thing. Is there something as a rule of thumb that like a red, yellow, white, pink, purple, green tomato has a specific tendency to taste like at all? Does color actually impact it at all?
I've not found it. I have found so many exceptions to all of those rules that I think if you were to take away the visual essence and the knowledge of the variety, you would not be able to, you wouldn't be able to mark them up or down or differently based just on their color. And so let me just say that from all of my growing, I have found a lot of the tomatoes that are on the more tart side do tend to be some of the old red beefsteak
Hmm.
types that showed up at farmers markets. Now, I will also say I haven't tasted too many of the current hype is about antho tomatoes, right? The black beauties and the black this. I have found through my limited experience with antho types that antho skin imparts a bit of a bitter quality to the flavor. So I have not fallen in love with any of the antho varieties yet. Although I grew Sergeant Peppers this year, which is a beautiful pink heart with a black
Yeah.
shoulder. That one's probably the best of the anthos that I've tasted. And we've developed a few anthos in our dwarf project, but they're not my favorite ones. Um, but here's another aspect of eating tomatoes is texture. And so where Joe Lample and I differed is he likes a firmer tomato, almost a little bit crunchy.
Oh,
And I like a tomato that melts in my mouth. So if I put a slice of a brandywine in a grilled cheese, it almost dissolves into just this incredible, intense, silky flavor experience.
and Joe wants more of like a steak cut. Yeah.
Yeah, almost like a firm, um, not quite too crunchy, but he rated the firmer tomatoes higher than I did, and I rated the juicier, more silky smooth, melt in your mouth tomatoes a little bit higher than he did, which is another preference. And so flavor isn't just flavor, but it is going to be texture that you would work into your evaluations. But it is fun to do this stuff, and it's fun to do the evaluations, and it's fun to help to match people with the flavors that they're looking
Yeah.
for. This age that we're living in is the best time in history for people who love to grow tomatoes. So chefs may be going completely out of their minds, finding
Oh, I'm
creative
sure they
ways to
are.
use the color,
Yeah.
the flavors, right?
Yeah, because chefs, I mean, we're only talking about just eating the tomato sort of as it is, whereas a chef is thinking, can I make it into a soup? Can I make it into a this? Can I make it? So there's so many different transformations. Maybe a bad fresh tomato becomes a good, soup tomato or whatever the case may be. So absolutely
Well, some
fascinating.
some of the some of the little artisan tomatoes that I'm not crazy about eating fresh, it would be like Blush and Maglia Rose and the Bumblebee series. They are wonderful if you cut them in half and put them in an oven with a little of olive oil, salt, and pepper, and just concentrate the flavor down a little bit. The other interesting thing about color, and this is for people who want to play with their tomatoes, the color of a tomato, as it looks like, is a combination of the flesh color and the skin color. And tomato skin colors come in yellow and clear. So if you were to take a pink tomato like Brandywine and a red tomato like Acres, West Virginia, and cut them in half and show the halves to a people, they would look like the same color. It is only when you work in the skin color on top that you can see the difference. So I think chefs have learned that to maximize the use of the colors of all these flavors, it's really good to use them in raw preparations like caprese salads or places where you get chunks of the tomatoes that have the skin and the flesh. And thankfully, most of the heirloom types are very thin skinned, so you don't end up having to, you know, have it be chewy and they're not very seedy, so you don't have the seed problem. You can tell I like to cook. This
Yeah,
now
yeah,
the
yeah.
chemist in me is starting to show through because I
Perhaps
have
that
a
is perhaps
blast.
that is part of the attraction for you is you do have that chemistry background and more of that science background. There's enough meat in this world of tomatoes to kind of go all the way,
Yeah.
right?
But you remind me of a last important tip. When I wrote my book, I sourced a study the USDA did where they tested the pH of about 500 different tomatoes of all different colors, shapes, and sizes. The acidity of tomatoes is about uniformly the
Mm.
same. And so the whole thing about a color being associated with low acid, it's really all about sugar. So if a tomato tastes sweet and fruity, there's so much sugar in it that it covers up the acidity that's there. And if a tomato tastes really sparkly and acid, then the genetics of the variety code for just a low amount of sugar, which allows, so it's just like German wine, which have a high acidity, and it's all about how much sugar is allowed to reside in, whether you perceive that wine as
That
tart or
that I
sweet.
did not know. That is very interesting. Very we've been given.
So you can can anything. You can can any
Yeah,
variety, any
yeah.
color together, and you don't have to worry about
Huh.
it.
Yeah, I found that similarly. I don't want to get too far here, but I found that similarly for sauce. You could sauce it all, Maybe some are a little bit better, but you could sauce it all. But we've gotten a fantastic primer, not only on flavor here, but on tomatoes in general, Craig. So it's been great to have you back on the show.
So much
Where
fun.
can people find your work? You've got a lot going on.
So the main thing is my blog is just craiglehoulier.com. I've got a FAQ there, which, it's funny. I've been tempted. Do I go to AI to start answering garden questions?
Yeah. No.
People send me an email. They're going to get my response. NC Tomatoman is where I am at Instagram, and that's where they can find my lives every week. And really, it's Epic Tomatoes and Growing Vegetables and Straw Bales. My email is nctomatoman@gmail.com. I love interacting with other gardeners. I love to help people through the issues that they experience. Only gardening, please. I mean, everybody's got issues, but I want to keep it to gardening.
No therapy.
Well, garden therapy is okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just looking forward. We'll see if the book comes off on my dwarf. I'm going to just keep gardening and having fun with it, and talking to, people doing good work like you, Kevin, is just wonderful. So I really appreciate it.
Likewise. It's been too long, and best of luck with everything. We'll put all the links in the description. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, for listening. Good luck in the garden, and keep on growing.